Hello, welcome to Abril ao Vivo Linguistics Online. My name is Barbara Kelly from the University of Melbourne. This series is an initiative of the Brazilian Linguistics Association and is designed to give students and researchers free access to state-of-the-art discussions on the most diverse topics related to the study of human language. Today in the series, we have Professor Rachel Nordlinger from the University of Melbourne and the Research Unit for Indigenous Languages. Rachel's talk today is on the morphology-syntax interactions in Australian languages, a multifaceted approach. Let me remind you that during Rachel's talk, you can put questions into the chat, and at the end of the talk, those questions will be asked to Rachel. Enjoy the talk.
Hello, hi everybody. Thanks, Barb. I'm just going to share my screen and hopefully you can see that. Thank you, Barb, for the introduction, and thank you particularly to the Abril ao Vivo team for the invitation to speak, and also for the incredible initiative and effort they've put in this year to creating such a fabulous resource for us during what has been and continues to be a difficult year for many people. So thank you so much for that. Before I start, I want to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the country where I'm situated here in Melbourne, Australia. These are the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. They're the traditional owners of this land, and I want to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging and future elders as well. And I'd like to acknowledge their language, Woiwurrung, as the language of this country. And I note that sovereignty was never ceded. I also want to acknowledge all of the language experts, Australian language speakers that I've worked with over many years, more than I like to think about sometimes, helping me to understand their fascinating languages. And really so much of what I'm talking about today is really due to their incredible sophisticated knowledge and their fascinating languages. And it's been a privilege to be able to work with them. In this presentation, I'm going to be talking about morphology-syntax interactions in Australian languages and how we can look at these in ways that contribute to our understanding of linguistic diversity. But before I get into that, I just thought I'd start with a brief overview of Australian languages for those of you listening who may not be familiar with the situation of language in Australia. So, Indigenous Australia is a place of great linguistic diversity. Across the continent, there are at least 330, maybe 350 distinct languages if we think about language from a linguist perspective, where we carefully distinguish languages from dialects. We might say there's 300 to 350 distinct languages. If we look at language from an Indigenous perspective, there's 800, maybe up to 1,000 different languages if we're not so concerned about separating distinct dialects from distinct languages. So either way we look at it, there's hundreds and hundreds of different languages across Australia. Of these languages, if we're working with the sort of 330 odd language figure, there's about 15 or so that are still being acquired by children as their first language, and these are mostly in central and northern parts of Australia. There's maybe another 80 or so that are still spoken in communities, but by elderly speakers, so these are not being acquired by children anymore as first languages. And there are also many languages across the country where communities are engaged in relearning and reviving and revitalising their languages. In terms of how these languages are related to each other, our sort of working assumption is that all Australian languages are related to each other, but this has yet to be definitively established with the really careful historical work that we need to really know that for sure. It's underway. Hopefully we'll be able to establish that at some point in the future. But what we do know is that the languages form a number of subgroups, maybe around 25 or so, and they split into one very large group that we call Pamanyungan. That's this whole area of white on the map here. Pamanyungan stretches across about 5/6 of the Australian continent and has been clearly shown to be a single language grouping. And then there's an additional 24 or so subgroups that are all found in what we call the top end of Australia, up in the northern parts of the Northern Territory and northern Western Australia. And we collectively refer to these as non-Pamanyungan languages. But it's important to remember that non-Pamanyungan is not a genetic grouping. It's really just a collection of subgroups that are not Pamanyungan. Of course, further historical work that is underway may well show there to be some higher level groupings amongst some of these non-Pamanyungan subgroups, but non-Pamanyungan itself is not a genetic group. So in Australian linguistics, we tend to talk about Pamanyungan languages and non-Pamanyungan languages. There's also a typological difference that mostly aligns with this genetic distinction. So Pamanyungan languages are heavily dependent marking, primarily dependent marking, and Walbury is perhaps one of the best known examples of a Pamanyungan language. You may have heard of Walbury. Non-Pamanyungan languages tend to be head marking primarily, and some are also polysynthetic. So Biningunwok is perhaps one of the better known non-Pamanyungan languages in Australia, and we'll see some examples soon of some of these languages. Australian languages are morphosyntactically complex in ways that have long been of interest to linguistic theory, and here are some examples on the slide, certainly not everything. But some of the ways in which Australian languages have been of interest over many years for discussions of morphosyntax. So Walbury, largely through the work of Ken Hale in the early 80s and subsequent to that, has been really central to the discussions of non-configurationality in syntax. Dirbal, largely through Bob Dixon's work in the 70s and beyond, has featured heavily in work on ergativity, and especially the notion of syntactic ergativity. Excuse me. And Australian languages have also featured prominently in work on case stacking, case functions, polysynthesis, and other topics such as these. Now, I've just given you some references on the slides. This is certainly not everything, but a bit of a taste of some of the work that's been done over the years. If we distill the essence of all of these topics where Australian languages have contributed to debates around morphosyntax, we could see that work on Australian languages has contributed to our understanding of the relationship between morphology and syntax, and particularly the ways in which languages can distribute meaning and function across these two domains in very different ways to achieve often similar communicative or grammatical purposes. So we find, for example, that morphology in some languages can do the work that is done by syntax in other languages. And this is really central, I think, to our understanding of human language and linguistic diversity. Now, of course, Australian languages are not the only languages where we see these sorts of phenomena. I'm just only talking about them today because they're the ones I know about best. All right, so let me give you some examples of what I'm talking about. We find, for example, that meanings or functions that are commonly expressed by syntax in some languages can be expressed morphologically in others. So in a non-configurational language, and here I've given you examples from Wambaya, grammatical relations are not encoded with phrase structure relations, so with syntactic position, but are encoded morphologically through case marking, and in the case of Wambaya, also through some bound pronominal marking on this auxiliary element. So if we want to say something like the child chased the dog, we would say nyoro nyoro gen alangani janji. And the information about subject and object, so the information about grammatical relations, is being encoded through the morphology. The presence of ergative case here on child, alangini, tells us that the child is the subject, as does the second position auxiliary here. I realise that should say singular, sorry. And the case marking on Janji, the absolutive case marking on Janji, gives us the information that in this clause, Janji is functioning as the object. And this information comes from the morphology, not from syntactic position. So we can actually put these words in other orders, such as alingini gena Janji nyoro nyoro, nyoro nyoro gena Janji alingini, Janji gena alingini nyoro nyoro. All of these different combinations are grammatical. They all express the same semantic meaning, that the child chased the dog. And in all cases, the information about subject and object is being encoded by the morphology, not through syntactic position. So that's one example where we can see morphology in a language doing the work that would be done by syntax in a language like English. We also can find in languages like Wambaya that even phrases can be distributed across the clause. And here we can see that clearly it's the morphology that is indicating how these words are related to each other. So here in this example, the moon grabbed her sleeping child. We have ngangi here at the beginning of the sentence marked in its ergative form. And we have warangarangani marked with ergative case. The fact that both of these elements are ergative marked tells us that they form a phrase, that it's this moon that we're talking about, and that the two of them are part of the object of the clause. Here, allergy is the object. It is in absolutive case, and it's being modified by a small non-finite clause, gulukbrada, meaning sleeping, the child that is sleeping. And in this case, gulukbrada has morphology on it. There's this brada marker here on the end that tells us that the subject of sleep is the object of the main clause. So once again, we can put these words in different orders, as I've shown here on the slide, and the morphology will tell us how the bits of the words, how the different words relate to each other. This is being encoded morphologically, not through syntactic structure, or at least not only through syntactic structure. We also find that morphology can provide information about syntactic structure beyond the word to which the morphology is attached. So this is where morphology is used to provide information about higher levels of syntactic structure. So this is shown in examples of case stacking, for example, such as the one here on the slide. In case stacking, in languages that have case stacking, we see that a single noun can carry multiple case markers, and each case marker provides information about higher levels of structure in which that noun is situated, or higher levels of syntactic relation. So here what we have is morphology actually giving us information about syntactic structure or hierarchical syntax. So if we have a look at this example here from Murrinhpatha, so I saw that euro with a joey in its pouch. Here a euro is a type of macropod, like a kangaroo, wallaby, that sort of an animal, not referring here to a piece of European currency. And a joey is the word that's used to describe the baby animals of this type. So I saw that euro with a joey in its pouch. If we look at the most deeply embedded or the most heavily marked nominal here in the clause, pouch, we see that pouch carries three different case markers. It has a locative case to convey in the pouch. It then has proprietive case marker in agreement with joey to show that it's modifying the joey that's in the pouch, so with the joey in the pouch. And then it carries accusative case marking to show that it's part of the larger object noun phrase. So if we think about just the information that's being conveyed by this one nominal with its morphology attached, we can see that just this nominal and its morphology alone is telling us quite a lot about the larger syntactic context in which this noun appears. So I've sort of sketched this out here in sort of phrase structure, functional structure LFG style. So we have the pouch here that has locative case, but we know from the morphology on the nominal here that this must be inside another noun phrase that has propriative case, and that it in turn must be inside another noun phrase that has accusative case and is functioning as the object. So one nominal can carry through its morphology a lot of information about its broader syntactic context. And I talked about this many years ago in my PhD research and showed how it could be dealt with in the lexical functional grammar framework. In polysynthetic structures, we see the clearest examples of where morphology can be seen to be doing the work that syntax does in other languages. Because in these structures, we see complex clauses, a whole sentence, a whole sort of complex sentence encoded with a single morphological word. So here we have an example from Binnengunwok. The Binnengunwok utterance consists of a single word, and I won't try to read this one to you since I don't speak Binnengunwok, but you can see it's a single word that's made up of quite a bit of morphological structure. The English translation, on the other hand, is a whole sentence with a number of words that themselves group into phrases and have internal hierarchical structure. And I've put some bracketing here, just very rudimentary bracketing to give you that sort of sense of the syntax. So what we find in Binnengunwok is a sentence that consists of just a single element, in this case a verb, a single verb, and that alone constitutes the sentence. So it's an extremely simple syntactic structure, but a very complex morphological one. In English, on the other hand, we have a much more articulated syntactic structure with multiple words grouping into multiple phrases. And we can see very clearly that the work that is being done by the syntactic structure in English is being done by the morphological structure in Binnengunwok. Okay, so we see fundamental organizational differences among and across languages where morphology and syntax can be used to achieve broadly the same communicative or communicative goals or grammatical structures. And this is not a new observation, of course. Many have observed this before, and it was captured many years ago by Joan Bresnan, who coined the phrase morphology competes with syntax in order to capture this idea that across languages we could see this interplay and tension between morphology and syntax and the extent to which they can do the same work. And this is really important for our understanding of language structure and for our theoretical models of morphosyntax, since we need to be able to capture the fact that the different modes of expression can be used to achieve the same grammatical outcomes. Now, I don't think this is a particularly controversial claim theoretically, but of course theories will differ in how they capture this, whether they capture it through separating function from the mode of expression, which is the approach used by theories like lexical functional grammar, for example, or they might capture it through other means, such as having shared underlying structures, which then, and series of derivations that move away from those up to a surface form, for example, and there's probably many other ways to deal with it as well. The theoretical analysis is not so much my particular focus here today. I take it as given that all theoretical models can capture this fact in some way, that morphology and syntax can do the same work across languages. What I want to focus on today is what I consider to be the bigger, more interesting and more important question, which is, what does it all mean? Does the mode of expression used, as in morphology or syntax, does it make any substantial fundamental difference? What difference does it make for a language to encode meaning and function in its morphology or in its syntax? Is the structural choice simply a sort of superficial difference of phonological organization or grammatical organization, or does it reflect a deeper difference with impacts on the whole linguistic system? Is there something fundamentally different about organising your language in one of these ways. I don't think we know the answer to this question yet. I actually think it's one of the big unanswered questions, one of the many big unanswered questions in our field. But I think it's really central to our understanding of the true nature of linguistic diversity. To understand it, we need to take a broader approach to looking at morphology-syntax interactions. So we need to integrate our language description and analysis with studies of language acquisition and linguistic processing across languages with different typologies so that we can really see what the potential impact is of these different design choices. And doing this is especially crucial and urgent since much of the world's linguistic diversity is highly endangered, as we know, and also largely under-described in many of these ways. So here's my very sophisticated graphic illustrating the nature of the problem. If we take the whole of the world's linguistic diversity, so let's say around 7,500 languages, at least the diversity that we're aware of for now, there are estimates that perhaps of this diversity, we have a substantial grammar of around 18% of the languages. We have some sort of grammar or sketch of just over 50% of the languages. So that's a large number of languages, a large proportion of the world's linguistic diversity for which we don't really have very much knowledge at all. The situation gets even worse when we then look at acquisition research. The estimates are, or recent estimates are, that acquisition research encompasses perhaps 1% of the world's linguistic diversity, so 70 to 80 languages, perhaps 1% of languages of the world. And then if we look at processing research, it's even worse. So current research in linguistic processing is estimated to have coverage of less than 30 languages around the world, or maybe about 0.4%, according to this publication from 2009. Perhaps it's slightly better now, but I think there's probably not that much difference. Oh, sorry, I've got a frog in my throat, as we say in English. Okay, so we really have a lot of work to do if we want to understand the true nature of linguistic diversity in this deeper sense that I'm talking about. So for the rest of this talk, I'm going to present some recent research that I've been involved in with various colleagues, where we try to address this bigger question from a broader perspective. Now, of course, I'm not going to answer this bigger question. So this is the question of what difference does it make if a language does something in its morphology or syntax. I'm not going to be able to answer this question in any complete way, of course. I'm just hoping to show you how fascinating it can be to ask the question and what we can learn about language diversity as a result. So one question that we want to ask is, how are radically different grammatical structures acquired? To address this question, myself and a team of collaborators over a number of years have been conducting a study of language acquisition in the polysynthetic Australian language Murrinhpatha. In this study, we're interested in exploring how complex verbal morphology is acquired in a polysynthetic language and how the nature of the grammatical system might impact on the learning task for the child. And here are all my collaborators. And I want to particularly acknowledge Bill Forshaw and Lucy Davidson, who were the PhD students on this project and did the research on which many of our findings are based. And today I'm going to particularly talk about findings from Bill Forshaw's PhD research. But first I'll just tell you a little bit about Murrinhpatha. Murrinhpatha is spoken by maybe 2,500 to 3,000 people in and around Wambaya in the Northern Territory. That might not sound like a lot of people, but in the Australian context, that's a large number of speakers for a language. It's one of the small number of Australian languages that's still being acquired as a first language by all children in the community and used daily by all the community members. It's head marking, polysynthetic language, it's incorporating, it's got just very minimal case morphology, although it does have around 10 noun classes that are marked with nominal classifiers. And there's been various other linguists who've worked on this language before and along with me, so there's some references acknowledging their work there. As I said, it's a polysynthetic language. It has a complex verbal template. And for our purposes today, it's not really going to be important to understand the full nature of this template. But what you can take away from this is that there are a lot of slots in the verb. There is a lot of complexity there. There are discontinuous dependencies in the verb. So for example, up here in slot 2, it's possible to have some subject number marking. There's also additional number marking that comes in slot 8. There's tense aspect mood marking here in slot 6 that also has to interact with tense aspect mood marking on the classifier stem in slot 1. So there's a number of discontinuous dependencies across the verbal template. There's a serialized classifier stem that goes on the end here that marks imperfective aspect. And the really perhaps additionally complex aspect of Murrinhpatha verbs is that the large number of them, certainly in terms of types, are complex predicates. So the blue cells here in the template illustrate the two parts of the complex predicate. I will call these the classifier stem, that's here in slot 1, and the lexical stem here in slot 5. And the large majority of verbs, verbal meanings in Murrinhpatha, require both a classifier stem and a lexical stem in a particular combination. So the two of these together give the predicate meaning for the verb. In the examples that come on, I'll underline each of these elements so that you can see how they're working together. So it's an important part of knowing how to speak Wambaya, Murrinhpatha, is knowing which lexical stem has to go with which classifier stem in order to give you the predicate meaning. So here's a few examples, just to give you a feel for the language. These are some of the polysynthetic verbs that we find built on this complex template. I'll just play you this verb here. So that describes an event where someone's sort of lying down and looking under his arm and sneakily watching people. Here's another one. This describes someone going through, there were a number of bags lying around and someone was going through all of the bags and stealing things out of them. These two verbs came from the same story that was full of lots of bad things happening, as you can tell. Okay, so just to give you a feel for how these classifier stems work, there are 38 different classifier stem paradigms, and each paradigm encodes information about the subject, so person and number of the subject, tense aspect mood, and some classificatory event semantics as well. And these are all sort of bundled up in at least synchronic portmanteau forms. These paradigms are full of suppletion and homonymy, and while there are some partial patterns within and across paradigms, there are no patterns across all the paradigms that are consistent, and there's lots of irregularity in the paradigms as well. So here's an example here, just a very simple example, just showing you a contrast between two paradigms. If I say ngawanda no, I am talking about an event where I'm going to split something open by using the end of a sort of long, thin instrument. So that's the information that comes from the use of this classifying nga that I've glossed poke here. It's events that are done through using a long, thin instrument but the end of it. So things like writing and shooting and those sorts of things. So this might describe a situation where I'm shooting at a coconut, and when I hit the coconut, it splits open. If I use a different classifier stem, so here nguandano, this is now a different classifier stem that describes events that are done using the long edge of an instrument. So this might describe a situation where I'm slicing something open with a knife or a stick, for example, or whacking something with a stick in order to cause it to split open. So you can see that just by changing the classifier stem, we get different meanings and different event characterizations. The combination of classifier and stem, lexical stem, is not always as transparent or semantically compositional as these examples. So sometimes you just need to learn, in fact often you just need to learn what classifier stem is required for the verb that you're wanting to express. So if you want to say he disappointed them, you have to use the classifier stem that refers to doing with the hands. If you want to talk about following, you have to use this poke classifier stem. And you can see here that the forms of the classifier stems are really very different from the different paradigms. So just to give you some example paradigms, here's the paradigm for the classifier stem that we gloss B. You can see there's multiple tense forms, there's multiple numbers, there's inclusive, exclusive distinctions. We're not really going to get into the details of these paradigms, but you could see here, for example, that we might identify a pattern where first person has this ng consonant at the beginning of the forms, second person alternates between th in singular and n in plural, and third person has k and p, for example. So that might be one pattern. But then when we go and switch to a different classifier stem, so this is the one to do with hands, many of these patterns change and we don't find the same pattern. So this is part of the issue, is that while we can find patterns in some paradigms and some paradigms share these partial patterns, other paradigms will do something very differently. And of course, there are 38 of these. Okay, so when we think about the learning task for the child, it's very complex. Not only do they have to learn the complex verbal template and get all the bits of the verb in the right order, they also have to learn the correct combination of classifier stem and lexical stem in order to get the desired meaning. And they have to select the correct form of the classifier stem from one of these numerous and partially suppletive paradigms. So this is why it was such an interesting language for us to investigate the acquisition of. So what we did is we recorded children running around and speaking Murrinhpatha. Here are some of the children that we worked with over the years. We wanted to get naturalistic interaction and naturalistic language from the kids. So what we did is we made these little backpacks. We put a recorder and wireless transmitter in the backpack. You can see the little microphone here, and the kids could then run around and play and talk to each other, and we could record their language, which obviously we later transcribed. We were actually initially worried that the children would be very resistant to wearing these backpacks, but after a while they actually turned out to be so popular and so many kids wanted to wear them that we even considered developing some placebo backpacks so that some kids could run around wearing backpacks and we didn't have to complicate our transcription task even further. So anyway, they were quite happy to wear the backpacks and it seemed to work quite well. And we took children and their family groups out into the bush areas outside where they live. This is a very common thing that families do, and because we would record their interactions but also record them with video but also through the backpacks and get to study the language that way. What I'm reporting on today is from Bill Forshaw's research. He did a longitudinal study of 5 children over a 2-year period, and the children were aged, the youngest child was 1 year 9 months at the beginning of the study, and the oldest child was 6 years 1 month at the end of the study. So his data sort of captures that age range across 5 different children. Well, what did we find? What did he find? Firstly, what we found is that children have actually acquired quite substantial morphological complexity by 3 years old, or by less than 3 years old, with very few morphological ordering errors or overgeneralizations. So here's an example of Acacia, just over 2.5, I'll play it for you. I never get tired of those sweet little voices. And you can see the verb here that she's saying, nangakutno, you will collect it for me, she said, or collect it for me, perhaps. And she's got quite a lot of complex bits of the verb in place. She's got the right classifier stem with the right lexical stem. She's got the tense agreement between the future form of the classifier stem and the future marker at the end. She's got oblique marking in the verb. There's quite a lot of morphological complexity that she has right at just 2 years, 7 months. Here's an example from Nathan. He's a year older in this example. And once again, he's got the right combination of classifier stem and lexical stem. He has things in the right form. He's got a serialized classifier on the end here that has the right agreement that it needs to have. So it needs to agree in categories with the main classifier stem. He's got all of that correct. So how do kids do this? Well, Forshaw found that children begin by using just a small subset of the full classifier paradigm. So the youngest children just use first singular and second singular future forms, which are also the ones used for imperatives, and third singular existential forms, which are what are used for locating people and objects. And the categories that they use then increase with age. So by 4 years, 11 months, or around 5, we see non-singular subject numbers come in. We see the full range of tense, aspect, mood, distinctions, and so on. So this suggests that what children do initially is they build little mini paradigms, just the first and second singular and third singular existential forms. And they use these to sort of bootstrap into the full verbal complexity, expanding with additional categories through the acquisition process as they get older. So this is just taken from Forshaw's thesis here. This first figure here is showing the different subject categories in the children's verbs. So you can see that in the youngest age bracket, we have just first singular and second singular forms. As children get older, we see third singular forms come in. They're the existential ones I was talking about. As they get older again, we see first inclusive forms come in, and then we start to see duals and plurals and so on as their age increases. If we look at the tense aspect mood in the classifier stem, again, at the very earliest ages, we see just future forms and existential forms. And then as children get older, we see other tense aspect mood categories come into their language. So children produce complex adult-like verbs from a very young age, but they start with a small restricted part of the paradigm and they expand to other categories over time. One thing that we found that I found quite interesting anyway is that the verb forms that children produce are almost always grammatically correct, in the sense that we did not find any errors in the templatic ordering. There's no children are putting the morphs in the wrong order, for example. They're not getting the discontinuous dependencies wrong. So we're finding that a lot of that morphological complexity children are getting right at a very early age. The forms may, of course, be phonologically impacted in lots of ways, or they might be used in the wrong contexts, but we don't find these errors of templatic structure or agreement or ordering. We also didn't find any clear overgeneralizations of the classifier stems, which I also found interesting, because given these 38 different classifier stem paradigms, you might expect that children would just pick some of the more common ones and overgeneralize them early on. But in fact, we didn't find that. We found very few examples of children using ungrammatical combinations of classifier stem and lexical stem. And in fact, the large majority of the verbs that children produce are grammatical adult forms. They might just use them in the wrong contexts or get the meanings wrong, but the actual form is grammatical for the most part. So that's interesting. So children are able to learn quite a lot of morphological complexity in Murrinhpatha at a really early age. And this is at ages where English acquiring children are still making well-known errors with much simpler English past tense morphology, for example. So this suggests that Murrinhpatha acquiring children are learning, well, what Forshaw suggested is that these kids are learning the whole word forms early on, and then they're using low-level processes of analogy to generate and acquire new forms as they get older, and so they're essentially getting the forms grammatically correct. So learning morphology in a polysynthetic language proceeds differently to learning morphology in a language like English. And this supports the idea that the typological properties of the language being learned affects the process of acquisition. And this has been claimed by others as well, of course. So children are able to adapt their learning to suit the language being learned. Languages are not all learned in the same way, but the typology of the language being learned affects the language acquisition process. So while Murrinhpatha and English achieve the same communicative goals with very different structures, so Murrinhpatha with its very complex polysynthetic morphology and English with a more elaborated syntactic structure, while we can say that aspects of these are functionally equivalent, they're not equivalent in terms of the learning task for children. Different structures need to be learned in different ways. So these different structural options are not just simple alternatives. They seem to have an impact, a deeper impact on language learning processes. So another area in which we might want to investigate the impact of mode of expression is in the area of linguistic processing. So with a different team of collaborators, I've been investigating the sentence planning and production of free word order properties in Murrinhpatha and Pitjantjatjara. So in this study, we're not so focused on the complex morphology in these languages, but actually the sort of other side of the coin. We're interested in what the impact is of their limited use of syntactic structure to encode grammatical relations, and as evidenced by the freedom of word order, like I was illustrating earlier for Wambaya. So the sorts of questions we're interested in are what is the processing impact of free word order? Are languages with flexible syntax or limited use of syntax to encode grammatical relations, are they processed in the same way as languages with fixed word orders? And to do this, we've done a sentence production study in Murrinhpatha and Pitjantjatjara using eye tracking. And we've followed a method that's been used for other languages with more fixed word orders to see how different or similar the results look in languages with free word order like Murrinhpatha and Pitjantjatjara. And this experiment involves a picture description task where we show speakers a picture, we ask them to describe what's happening in the picture, and the eye tracker records their eye movements to the different characters in the picture in the planning stage, and we have a look at how those eye movements relate to the utterance that they produce in order to describe the picture. But I'll show you a bit more about this in a moment. And just acknowledging my collaborators there. So in this study, we've looked so far at Murrinhpatha and Pitjantjatjara, and we know now about Murrinhpatha. It's a head marking polysynthetic language. Pitjantjatjara is typologically very different. It's a Pamañungan language. It's dependent marking. It has ergative case. It doesn't have any of the head marking that Murrinhpatha has. So in this sense, the two languages are typologically quite distinct, but they've both been described as having syntactically flexible free word order. And they're both still very strong, vibrant languages spoken as first languages in their communities. So we ran this experiment with 43 speakers of Murrinhpatha in Wambaya in the Northern Territory, and with 49 speakers of Pitjantjatjara in Bukatja in South Australia. And you can see this is me doing the experiment with the Murrinhpatha speaker here. The eye tracker is just a little bar that sits underneath the laptop screen here. So as participants are looking at the picture, the eye tracker is just recording their eye movements so that we can see which characters they look to when, and then we can see how their eye movements relate to the order of constituents in the sentence that they produce to describe the picture. So we showed participants 141 different pictures. Of these, 48 were the events we were actually interested in. These are our experimental events. They're all what we call transitive events, or events where there are a clear agent and patient participant involved. And then there were 93 fillers, which were largely intransitive events that were interspersed throughout our experimental target pictures. The test pictures were all fully crossed with, we fully crossed participant role with humanness. So we have equal numbers of human agents acting on human patients and human agents acting on non-human patients and so on. And we also controlled for left and right. So the images were reversed in 50% of the trials so that we could control for that as well. Okay, so firstly, what did we find? Well, in terms of just looking at word order to begin with, we did find a range of word orders produced. So this is consistent with the idea that these languages have flexible word order options. So in both languages, we found 10 different word orders, and they've been grouped here in terms of agent initial, patient initial, and verb initial orders. And there are some differences across the languages. So in Murrinhpatha, the most common ordering was AVP, or subject, verb, object. In Pitjantjatjara, it was APV, agent, patient, verb, or subject, object, verb. But in both cases, in both languages, this most common order was still only found in about 50% of responses. So there's still quite a range of word ordering possibilities, as you can see. Another difference is that we find more verb initial responses in Murrinhpatha than we do in Pitjantjatjara, which may relate to the typological differences between the languages. We're not sure. But overall, we see that there's a lot of variability in both languages, and that they're similar in some respects, but also different. Okay, so what about the eye tracking data? Well, previous studies that have run this experiment on languages with fixed word orders have found that there is a clear relationship between the word order of the language and the word order produced by the speaker and the eye patterns, so where they look in the picture. So in SVO languages like Dutch and English, researchers found that in the planning stage, so when speakers are initially shown the picture, they will look mostly on the agent, mostly to the agent, perhaps a little bit to the patient, but mostly at the agent, and then move on to look at the other participant later on. But in that first 600 milliseconds, where they're first seeing the picture, speakers of SVO languages will look primarily at the agent and then move on later to look at the other participants. In verb initial languages like Tseltal and Tagalog, researchers found that speakers in this first 600 milliseconds look more evenly across agent and patient before they then move on to construct their sentence. So we see a relationship between the word order properties of the language being spoken and the way in which speakers are planning their sentences, as indicated by their eye movements to different participants in the scene early on in the planning stage. So we asked what would happen in a flexible word order language like Murrinhpatha and Pitjantjatjara. What do we find? Well, let's have a look. So these charts show the eye movements across all of the participants in the experiment. And let's look first at the Dutch. So in this first 600 milliseconds, this is the point at which the first 600 milliseconds after the picture has appeared on the screen. What we see in the Dutch participants in this SVO or AVP word order is, as I was saying, you can see very clearly that the large majority of looks, so this shows us the proportion of fixations or the proportion of looks to agent in black, patient in red. So we see very clearly in Dutch that the large majority of looks are to the agent in this first 600 milliseconds, which corresponds with the fact that the agent is going to be the first expressed participant in this AVP word order. What do we find in Murrinhpatha? Actually, we see something very different. So in the Murrinhpatha chart here, red is now the agent. So this is proportion of looks to the agent, and blue is proportion of looks to the patient. And what you can see in Murrinhpatha is that actually in this first 600 milliseconds, participants are looking much more evenly across both characters. They're not looking primarily at the agent, even though this is still the looks that correspond to an AVP word order. They are not looking primarily to the agent in the way that the Dutch participants did. So even though here we've got the same word order in Murrinhpatha and Dutch, the eye tracking patterns are very, very different. And crucially, what we find in Murrinhpatha is what is called relational encoding very early on in the eye tracking record, where in the first 600 milliseconds, participants are looking more evenly across both characters. So they're essentially processing the whole event at this very earliest stage. So this is the first, as I said, 600 milliseconds. So these differences suggest that when producing AVP sentences, speakers of different languages encode the event differently and follow different planning strategies. In Murrinhpatha, we see speakers prioritizing relational encoding very early on, whereas the Dutch speakers are prioritizing character-specific information, so looking primarily at the agent. Now, interestingly, we find this relational encoding in all of the Murrinhpatha word orders. Well, here we're just looking at the word orders that involve expression of both agent and patient. But you can see that across the different word orders, we still find that in the first 600 milliseconds, Murrinhpatha speakers engage in this relational encoding. They're looking quite evenly across both agent and patient in this first 600 milliseconds, irrespective of the actual word order they end up producing. What was even more interesting to us is that we might have thought, well, perhaps this is because Murrinhpatha has head marking. As we know, it's a polysynthetic language. It has a lot of verbal morphology. And maybe this is because in order to encode the verb, speakers need to look across the whole event so that they know all the participants involved very early on so they can begin to construct the verb. But in fact, we find this same relational encoding in the Pitjantjatjara data where there is no head marking and there's only dependent marking. So I've only got time here to show you I'm just showing you the agent initial responses here. But you can see that we have Murrinhpatha here on the left of the slide, Pitjantjatjara on the right of the slide, and in all cases we find this very similar relational encoding in the first 600 milliseconds. So what this shows us is it's irrespective of the morphological properties of Murrinhpatha and Pitjantjatjara. What it seems to be is that this relational encoding is what is required when you're speaking a free or flexible word order language, and is very different from what speakers of fixed word order languages like Dutch and so on do when they're constructing sentences with the same word orders. So despite the very different typologies, we find very similar patterns in the eye tracking data in Murrinhpatha and Pitjantjatjara, but these are very different to what we find in the eye tracking data speakers of other languages with more fixed word orders. So planning sentences in a flexible word order language is really different from planning sentences in languages with fixed word orders. The word order flexibility seems to require more relational encoding in the very earliest stages of sentence planning, and this is true independently of other morphological properties like head marking and dependent marking. So speaking a free word order language requires different planning strategies in sentence production. This shows us that languages are processed differently depending on their typological properties. And again, coming back to this sort of larger point, while morphology and syntax can be used by languages to achieve similar communicative goals, the mode of expression matters. If you are speaking a language where you are using morphology to encode information about grammatical relation and therefore not using syntax and therefore having a freer syntactic word order, you need to plan your sentences differently. So in conclusion, we know that morphology and syntax can do the same work, and we know that this needs to be captured in our theoretical models of language structure. But we can't just stop there and assume that this functional equivalence means that they're equivalent in all respect. In fact, different structural choices can have interesting impacts on the broader linguistic system, as reflected in things like language acquisition and linguistic processing and so on. In order to properly understand linguistic diversity, therefore, I say, we need to take a multifaceted approach to morphology-syntax interactions, and we need to supplement our structural and theoretical analyses of the work that morphology and syntax do with work on acquisition and processing in typologically diverse languages if we want to really understand linguistic diversity and its ramifications. Thank you. Here are my references.
Thanks very much, Rachel. That was terrific. There are so many different areas that we could discuss, and we have a few questions that have come into the chat. If you have questions for Rachel, please post your questions in the chat and we'll endeavour to have them conveyed to her. So one question that we have, Rachel, is about the sentence production eye tracking study. And someone has asked, in the sentence production eye tracking study, you controlled for left and right. Did you control for height or any other positioning on the screen? No, I'm not aware that we did, but if I just go back to showing the pictures, I guess we had a range of positioning. So this is just an example of some of the stimulus. We had a range of positioning across the screen, but we didn't explicitly control for it, no. Okay.
I don't know whether we might expect that to make a difference to the ordering, but
yeah. You could see different heights are used, across the different pictures in any case. So, okay, thank you.
In many of our pictures, there's not that much difference in height between the participants. So, and since they were also reversed in 50% of the trials, then we might expect that to sort of balance out over the course of the experiment.
Yeah, okay. Great, thank you. Another one about child language. So someone has asked, the child at 2 years, 7 months had a 4-syllable complex word. And the question is, what does the input look like to a child at that age and earlier? So is the input modified?
Good question. So we're still looking at the input, as Barb knows, since we're looking at it together. But certainly what we've found so far is that there is very little modification to children in input. So adults use the full complexity of the verbs as they need to. We don't find an overwhelming simplification of verbs. The fully complex verbs with multiple syllables are used towards children in even at very young ages. So that's certainly what we've found so far.
Yeah. Very interesting. Okay, another question here about children. So do children's categories that increase with age reflect the order that categories are acquired across languages other than English? I think you spoke about English in one of your examples, And this question is asking more broadly,
Mm-hmm.
what other sorts of things do we find?
That might be a question for you, Barb, rather than me. I'm not a specialist in language acquisition, so I'm not on top of all of the acquisition literature. I think we know that it's very common for children to use imperative forms early on, and so the fact that we find the younger children learning using second singular future imperative forms is not a surprise at all. My understanding is that's a very common early category for children to acquire. I'm not sure about the other sort of facts about different tense categories and numbers and so on. I don't know, Bar, whether you know anything more about that than me.
There are lots of similarities.
Okay.
Great. All right. Are there any other questions? If you have any other questions for Rachel, can you put them in the chat, please? Just wait a moment and have a look. Question about, just a reminder about how many people speak Murrinhpatha?
There's about 2,500 to 3,000 people that speak Murrinhpatha, and roughly about the same that speak Pitjantjatjara, give or take. These are, in the Australian context, these are languages with a lot of speakers. In a world context, talking about 3,000 speakers seems very, very small. But in fact, we think even pre-colonization and so on, even when we're not sort of thinking about language endangerment, probably most Australian languages didn't have very, very large numbers of speakers anyway. So we sort of think that Murrinhpatha with 3,000 speakers, for example, is probably as many as it's likely always had, if not more.
All right, terrific. Great. So are there any more questions? Okay, well, on that note then, I'd like to thank Rachel, thank you on behalf of Berlin, and I'd like to invite everyone to please continue watching this series that's come to mean so much to linguists around the world through 2020. As Rachel suggested at the start, it's been a really challenging year for everyone worldwide. And this series has been a fantastic initiative for linguists to be able to get together to see the amazing work that people are doing. Do you have any final remarks, Rachel?
Well, just to echo that, thank you everybody who is listening or maybe will listen in future online. If you have any other questions, feel free to send me an email. And to everyone around the world, stay safe and look after yourselves. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Can I just also remind you that should you like to revisit this talk and other talks in the series, you can do so on YouTube. So the talks are available on YouTube. All right. Thanks very much, everyone. Stay safe.
Bye.